Hello and welcome to Legally Consumed, a consumer products podcast by a consumer products law firm in Australia. I'm Raph Goldenberg and I'm joined by co-hosts Kay Ho and Will McMinn, who are members of the team at CIE Legal.
We chat with executives of consumer products companies, their legal teams and industry experts who give us a peek into their journeys as people. We explore industry-changing ideas and even share tips and tricks on how to navigate the consumer products space.
This season, we will feature guests from the automotive, retail, advertising and insights, food, beverage, and primary production and franchising sectors.
Hi everyone, welcome to Legally Consumed, CIE Legal's podcast about consumer products by the consumer product lawyers. Today we have a very special guest, Professor Michael Milford. Michael is a professor at the Queensland University of Technology and is an expert in robotics as well as driverless cars or autonomous cars. That's all I'm going to say about Michael. Michael, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself. And if I could start by asking you, what was your first job?
My first job was very decidedly not technological. I worked at Donut King making donuts.
Right. Very good. What did you do after that? And how did you end up where you are today?
Well, to not give you my whole life story, I guess a couple of highlights were I was fascinated by science fiction when I was a kid. I loved science fiction books and I loved science fiction movies like The Terminator, fabulous movies to grow up with. Another formative experience that put me on my current career journey was I was a victim of hacking early on, and revenge motivated my desire to learn how to code and program, and then I never looked back from that point onwards.
Right. And so what did you, before you started teaching people, what did you study?
I studied mechanical and space engineering. The other thing that fascinated me was rockets, but rockets are like a long payoff thing. You have to work on them for decades sometimes, and sometimes they blow up on the launch pad and you're back to square zero. So then I pivoted into artificial intelligence and robotics, and that's where I am today.
Fantastic. So you're at Queensland Uni of Technology. How long have you been there, and sort of what was the path to, because you look too young to be a professor?
Oh, thank you. Academia is a youthful game. Keeps me young on the outside, definitely not young on the inside. I did a PhD with an amazing supervisor, once again in the robotics space. Did a bunch of sort of research roles at a fairly junior level, got what you call a faculty job at QT in 2011, so that's a whole 11 years ago. Sort of rose up through the ranks, became a professor. I'm currently joint director of the QT Centre for Robotics. First part of my career was very much more on the sort of basic research side of things, but most of the last decade, we've been doing a lot more applied work with companies, government, sort of translating a lot of the technology that we create into potential commercial applications, and also a lot of outreach and engagement. So making sure everyone understands what's really behind these technologies, that they're not to be scared of, that they might not be able to do everything that people say they can do, because an informed population and informed set of stakeholders is a beautiful thing to have.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think one of the things that interests me is sort of this connection between artificial intelligence, human psychology, robotics, and this whole kind of... have you had to study how the brain works to kind of become an expert in artificial intelligence and robotics?
I've never formally studied the brain, but I was thrown into the deep end basically from my first steps as a PhD student all the way to today. I was really fortunate to be on some projects with some of the world's most amazing neuroscientists and psychologists, for example. And so through them, I informally learned a lot, just enough to be dangerous, I guess you'd say, about neuroscience and cognition in the brain. And people talk about how modern artificial intelligence in software is based on how we think the brain works. And while that's not necessarily true at a very detailed level, it definitely draws a lot of its inspiration. And we're only just starting to scratch the surface. We don't really understand everything about how the brain works.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really exciting work to be done over the coming years.
Which it's a nice segue. I mean, we spoke earlier in the driverless cars space about the idea of deep learning, and one of the things that I found incredible that you spoke about was, in effect, some of this AI technology and the deep learning sort of framework is based off the brain, in the sense of all these different connections that are made within the brain and the sort of a neural network. Can you speak a little bit about, I guess, about that? Because it just makes me sort of think, gosh, the brain is such an amazing thing in itself that computers are now trying to copy it.
Yeah, and the brain is the most complex, sophisticated thing as humans. We know it's 80 or 90 billion neurons and a much larger number of connections between those neurons or cells in the brain. So we're really just scratching the surface. So at a very high level, these artificial neural networks that people program into software that power our robots, power the product recommendations that you get when you shop online, that's all driven by this approach called, I guess, modern AI. And a lot of that is based on these very large artificial neural networks which have been put into software and then deployed. Another key aspect of it is they're trained on very large amounts of data. So just like as a child, you learned a lot about the world by interacting with it. At a very high level, we train these artificial intelligence systems in a broadly similar way.
Right. Now, I want to talk a little bit about driverless cars. Firstly, what are they? I've heard people call them autonomous vehicles. Is there a difference? Can you tell us a little bit about driverless cars, just at a high level?
So the terminology varies. There's autonomous vehicles, driverless, self-driving car. They're probably the three most popular terms.
Yep.
The good thing about this is it's much easier to define than a term like artificial intelligence, which no one has really agreed upon for a definition. So an autonomous vehicle is essentially some sort of vehicle, it could be any size, that to a large degree is able to drive itself in whatever its operational environment is. That's obviously a fairly loose definition, and so you can have a vehicle that moves passengers around at an airport, or you could have this sort of the widespread robotaxi dream of just having autonomous vehicles everywhere in all cities, which are the basic way that people get around.
Yeah, and one of the things I don't think I necessarily realised until I spoke to you was that I'd always imagined driverless cars driving people around on the road, but they're also used not to take passengers. So there are some autonomous vehicles out there and some applications, is that right, in that space where, you don't have a passenger in the car?
Yeah, and the passenger carrying robot taxi, so to speak, was the big sort of driver. That's where all these $1 trillion market size valuations come from. But as people become a bit more realistic about what's possible in the near term, companies are starting to pivot and look at other business models. One of the most promising is autonomous delivery vehicles. So this might be a vehicle that delivers your groceries, just like you currently get your groceries delivered, except it's not driven by a person. Few technical advantages to that. You don't really care that much whether your groceries take 15 minutes or 3 or 4 hours to get to, as long as the price is right. You can air condition or keep the groceries refrigerated in the vehicle. And it's also easier from a safety perspective because you're not trying to protect any passengers in the vehicle. The problem is, of course, that there are already very well-oiled, optimized delivery business models, which are quite cheap for the consumer. And so how do you make an entry into that market where the market's already quite saturated?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how driverless cars work and sort of the technology behind them?
Sure. At a broad level, there's really two key components of how a driverless car works. There's all the technical hardware on the car, and that really comes down to the computers that it carries, because most of the computation or AI is done on the vehicle itself. It's not sent off to the cloud. And the other big component of the hardware is the sensors. So cars need to see and understand what's happening in the world around them. So they typically have a combination of radar sensors, camera sensors, a type of range detection sensor called LiDAR, perhaps sonar, and a bunch of other types of sensors. And it combines all of this information together and then feeds it into the second key component of what powers a driverless car, which is the onboard artificial intelligence. And these are the systems that process what the car is seeing, make sense of what pedestrians and other vehicles are around the car, and then works out how to drive safely and effectively through that environment.
Yeah, right. So you mentioned that at the moment they're not necessarily connected to the cloud. Does that mean that some of the issues around security and hacking into an autonomous car are the same sort of risk that you might imagine?
There's definitely a risk in terms of hacking, and they most definitely are connected to the cloud, but they're not making their second-to-second decisions based on information coming down from the cloud. But they're uploading their data, they're getting data down from the cloud. Hacking is a concern. The good news there is this isn't a brand new problem for autonomous vehicles. We've had the same concerns for planes, for smartphones, and lots of other technical devices in our life. There are some variations. Obviously, a vehicle is more dangerous if it gets out of control than a smartphone potentially, but we're not starting from zero, and there's been a lot of good work there already.
Yeah, and I think, gosh, if we can manage it with a plane, you just made me freak out about my next trip. The idea that someone might be able to hack into a plane, but then hopefully we can manage it in autonomous cars. So you gave us a bit of a snapshot about the delivery vehicles. Can you give us a bit of a feel as to how the technology is being used currently? When I say, I think there's different types. We have obviously some autonomous systems where the car reacts to certain things on the road. I'm talking about, actually lack of driver intervention. Is there much going on around the world at the moment on the roads?
In terms of trials where there isn't necessarily a safety driver in the car, there are a number of trials. There's trials by a few companies going on in San Francisco. If you've been to San Francisco, that's a challenging environment to drive in. Apart from anything else, it's very hilly. There are also trials in Phoenix, and probably a number of trials happening in other countries like China as well.
And you've been in some of those cars?
Yeah, I've been
not the passenger
joyriding in autonomous vehicles for the last 10 years. The first autonomous vehicle ride I ever got was the Google car in 2012. And for about 5 or 10 minutes, it was the most remarkable experience. And then I instantly forgot I was in a car that didn't have a driver. And ultimately, that's a good sign for technology.
I was going to say, was it a scary experience in the first little bit, just that lack of control? Or
I'm a geek, and this is my area, so it's very exciting. But then it rapidly became very mundane, except when the vehicle did something different to what you might expect a human driver to do.
Yeah. I'm also interested in how autonomous vehicles might change if, assuming there'll be a point at which they become adopted and become more mainstream, but how they might change our environment that we live in just outside. I mean, aside from the fact that, people won't be actually controlling the car, a computer will. Can you talk a little bit about that and whether or not there's been some thought of planning into how that will all look?
There's a lot of futurists around the world earning their living by talking about all of these possibilities, some backed up by evidence, some more speculative. If we take the middle scenario where autonomous vehicles are not perfect, but they are good, one of the things you might see is a lot less people would own cars. There'd be a lot fewer vehicles full stop on the roads, and the layout of the city and how people commute or don't commute to work and where they live could all change substantially. So the notion of central business districts, of where people tend to reside, the notion of there even being a rush hour, these are all things that could change substantially if you saw the number of vehicles drop substantially, ownership of vehicles drop substantially because autonomous vehicles are here.
And I know this is in the realm of futurism, but at the moment, I think people are so wired to having their own vehicle, but do you see a time in the future where people are happy to kind of share? Because obviously to reduce the number of cars on the road, that's the only way to do it, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're old, just to remind you. If you look at the precedent of other technologies that have come in, the one I always use at a much more minor scale is streaming media. So if you queried people before streaming media became a thing, the idea of no longer owning your movies and music was really abhorrent to a lot of people. But a younger generation who grew up with it, where the tech pretty much worked, it was relatively cheap, they largely didn't even think about it. And the same could happen with autonomous vehicles. You see the age at which people get their driver's licenses already with ride-sharing vehicles being available, dropping in certain areas. And so there's already a precedent that if the technology works, younger people at least won't even think much about it.
Yeah, right. And what do you, I mean, in terms of the impact on industries once this starts, because I feel like, despite all the naysayers, that this is sort of an inevitable development that's with no knowledge, but it just seems like it's heading that way. But the impact on industries, the industries are likely to be affected. I mean, we do a lot of work in the automotive space. How will it affect the car companies, other industries? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. So it depends on the exact scenario. If we go with the scenario where there's just a lot fewer vehicles, and obviously any company that makes its primary revenue from selling vehicles will need to change its business model, and the whole sector may change. But there's opportunities there too in terms of the vehicle generating ongoing revenue. You can have some sort of shared autonomous vehicle service. So there are new business models which may be just as attractive, but they'd require a major change.
Yeah. I guess one of them might be advertising. If you start, we see it in the lift, as we came up before, it's advertising everywhere. The more eyeballs you have, sort of a public space.
And this has already happened with non-autonomous vehicles. Lots of cab companies around the world will already serve you non-turn-offable, non-mutable apps.
Yes.
And you can imagine in the ultimate capitalist vision that your subscription service would be at different tiers, and the higher the tier, the less ads get forced upon you.
Yeah, okay. Pay for the silence. I like it. So why are we doing this? Like, what are the benefits of driverless cars? Why is there so much academic and commercial interest in this topic?
So there's a lot of rational motivation and also quite a bit of irrational motivation. So the irrational motivation is it's an incredibly fascinating technical challenge. And that's what's drawn a lot of these companies and these technical people to work on it. It's like the space race for our generation in some respects. The rational reasons are really economic and health. So economic is if you become a company who's successful in this space and manage to maintain a good market share, theoretically, it might be quite lucrative for you, whether it's autonomous delivery robots or passenger carrying robot taxis. From a health perspective, the numbers that are always bandied around is sort of the automotive road toll associated figure, which is over 1 million globally, and much larger number in terms of injuries. And so if you can make a significant dent in that, you have a huge beneficial impact on quality of life for lots of people that would have otherwise been affected tragically by this. It's not that simple though. I feel I should mention that the areas where it's most economically viable to deploy autonomous vehicles are often the areas where the per capita road toll is the best. And so the areas which would really benefit potentially from this technology might not get it for a lot longer.
Can you drill down a little bit into like why we think that there'll be a net reduction in road accidents as a result of autonomous vehicles?
Humans are incredibly capable at what they do. The fact that we can drive probably shouldn't be, but people drive while tired, while distracted, and still generally don't crash is a testament to how incredible humans are at what they do. But ultimately, humans are fallible, and humans are generally getting better.
Yeah.
Or not substantially better. Most of the road toll improvements have been around much better vehicle technology. It's much safer to be in a crash now than even probably 20 years ago. So the allure of autonomous vehicle or even assisted autonomous driving is that, at least theoretically, you can keep improving it until it's about as close to perfect as you could imagine.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the questions that in my mind when I've thought about this and heard you speak about it. It's the thing that feels like it's holding up adoption is the corner case, yes, we might, if you look at it objectively, we might, reduce car accidents and injuries and have millions of people saved as a result of the technology, but there'll be a certain number of unpredictable accidents, and my sense is that people just aren't willing to let that be decided by a computer, that somehow a person should control that. What are the I guess that's my personal little soapbox view of it, but for you, what's the risk that keeps you up at night when you think about driverless cars, or are you kind of more comfortable with the whole?
On a sort of practical near-term basis, the thing that did concern me a lot years ago, but isn't as much of a concern now, was that these big, very powerful corporate players who are driving this technology race would come in with this product and sort of overwhelm local and federal governments. And as a result of it not being fully thought out in terms of their introduction, that essentially the public might get screwed. I think I'm nowhere near as worried about that, because now in all my interactions with government and bureaucrats, they are an order of magnitude more informed than they were probably even 5 or 6 years ago. And that's a very healthy situation to be in, because they're going to run a pretty skeptical eye over any company trying to introduce this tech here, which is great.
That's great. I mean, do you have, I mentioned one risk, but what are some of the big issues that are still to be worked through, I guess? Because it seems like, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like to a degree the technology is pretty well developed. We have cars on the road, as you said, in San Francisco, driving around. What are the issues that you think, the big issues that need to be worked through before we see, autonomous cars adopted on a large scale?
There's really two key issues. One is, are they technically capable of doing the job that we need them to do? And the second one is economic case. So for simpler autonomous tasks like autonomous delivery, you can argue that they're probably already sufficiently technologically capable, but the margins aren't as good economically. And so the economic case may or may not be there. In terms of the holy grail, so to speak, of widespread passenger carrying autonomous vehicles everywhere, the economic case, although not as rosy as I think people originally imagined, is probably still there, but we don't quite know yet technologically whether it's up to scratch. The good news is, from these trials that are being performed, maybe not the public, but some people will start to get some pretty compelling statistics at scale about the exact viability of these systems.
Yeah. I think we talked before about some of the infrastructure related issues, and I think one of the things that I've heard bandied around about autonomous cars is that they can't really work without massive changes to infrastructure, which I've also heard spoken about in the EV space. With the EV thing, I think it's a pretty clear case there. You do need to build the charging infrastructure. Would you agree with that as a proposition in relation to autonomous cars? Like, can we start using them without the infrastructure and things being detected on the side of the road?
From the commercial side of things, most of the companies would really like their tech, including autonomous vehicles, to require as little modification by their customer, right? Mm-hmm. So most of them are trying to design it to not require extensive changes to the infrastructure. From the public and government side of things, the potential benefit of autonomous vehicles is probably not great enough to justify investing billions of dollars in investing in modifying infrastructure. And so that's something that I at least would definitely suggest exercising caution around. You don't want to prop up a technology that's not ready for game time with unsustainable investment in things like massive infrastructure change.
Which also, and that resonates, because I think we've sort of seen that in Australia with EV. It just seems like there's always been this this argument, this reason we haven't been able to, get adoption of EV, and the markets, the OEMs aren't sending the cars here because there's just not the infrastructure yet. So maybe there's a learning coming out of that for autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, and they need their product to be commercially viable in all the other markets apart from Australia. Yeah. So regardless of what we do, if those other markets require no infrastructure changes, they're going to have to solve that problem anyway, and just be an afterthought.
Yeah, makes sense. Look, it is the topic of the podcast, or the name of the podcast is Legally Consumed, and it would be remiss of me not to think about some of the legal issues and talk to you about some of the legal issues associated with autonomous cars. As a lawyer, it excites me because, you, as a lawyer, always think about worst case scenarios. Have you had a think, or when you, in your discussions with companies that are involved in this, around product liability, accidents, insurance, all this sort of stuff, cybersecurity, and how do you have any personal thoughts about that, and do you have a sense about how the researchers who are trying to, deploy this technology are tackling those sorts of issues?
Yeah, cybersecurity is particularly topical at this moment, and obviously that's a concern. You can weaponize an individual autonomous vehicle, and while you can take a lot of measures to protect against that, getting 100% guarantees on being safe is pretty much impossible to achieve for these sort of systems, especially if it's a consumer vehicle that's out and about on streets. So who is liable in that case? Can you insure against it? Those are all pretty big issues. In terms of liability, one of the things I always say is you will be able to understand and dissect exactly what has gone wrong when an autonomous vehicle is involved in an accident. And this, you've seen this play out with some of the high-profile accidents overseas. They've been able to dig into the detailed records and basically work out exactly what went wrong. But that's the technical side of things.
Yeah.
How do you then attribute who's responsible for that? Yeah. My main concern, and being very naive in this area, is based on my understanding of how big companies have got away with other stuff. My main concern would be there won't be sufficient liability traced back to the important people in these companies. But at the same time, you don't want to stifle innovation by being over-regulating stuff as well. It's a tricky balance to tread.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you, where are we at in Australia, like compared with other countries in relation to autonomous cars? There's probably two sides to that question. One is what you do, the research and, and consulting side. The other part of it is the actual use of autonomous vehicles on Australian roads or in an Australian setting.
So we have a small number of Teslas operating in Australia, so you could argue that's sort of some level of autonomous vehicle penetration. Government has come a long way at local, state and federal levels in the last probably 5 or 6 years, so they're much more informed. They've run a lot of trials of various subcomponents of autonomous vehicle technology. We've thought about how autonomous vehicles would adapt to Australian specific problems, like kangaroos is the one that's talked about a lot, but also Australian signage, the fact we drive on the left side of the road, all these sort of things. So we're in a pretty well-informed position. The government is in a reasonable state to sort of adopt the technology if it comes. There have been trials in various communities, so the public has probably seen an autonomous shuttle bus at some stage in a city or a sporting stadium. We don't have a very vibrant technical investment ecosystem, so there aren't many startups operating, or almost none in this space in Australia. They're all overseas. We shine in the off-road autonomous vehicles area. So we've literally led the world in developing autonomous vehicles for mining. And in mining, it's a great flagship example because they're not there for novelty value. They're there because they make economic sense. And there are very surprisingly few, or maybe not surprising for many, there are very few enduring commercially viable deployments of robots or autonomous vehicles in the globe. And autonomous vehicles in mining is one of those.
Yeah, I could imagine there'd be things that are they're passengers in these mining vehicles.
There's a variety. You'll have load haul dump trucks operating underground.
Yeah.
In semi-autonomous mode or autonomous mode. You'll have trucks above the ground operating autonomously, hauling or around. And then you'll have remote operators supervising them from an air-conditioned control room, sometimes thousands of kilometers away.
Yeah, and that's the one that I've heard about. And I think the miners probably have a different appetite for risk and just how quickly can we get stuff out of the ground. So maybe that'll be, an application that will drive some improvement in technology, more. Do you see that as, where the money is probably where what's going to force the technology moving forward and the adoption maybe?
And it's not just the money, it's very edifying to look at agriculture and to look at mining and to look at the differences in terms of automation penetration into mining versus agriculture. People have thought a lot about this. People have thought that the family-based background to agriculture, there's a different culture around technological innovation compared to mining, where it really is predominantly large and medium-sized sort of company players. Say what you will about mining, they seem very willing to adopt technology that will provably give them another 0.5% efficiency gain in their operations because they know exactly how that will translate into their bottom line.
Yeah.
So there's a direct accountability trail from the innovation to how this is going to affect their economics.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit? I know there's also military application for autonomous vehicles. Probably for obvious reasons, there are certain areas where you want to have vehicles go in, but you don't want to have people go in. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in that space? Have you done any work in those industries?
Yeah, so we work extensively in aspects of defence. Defence is growing as a R&D field in Australia. It's been interesting. So the US Defence Forces initially had this nominal goal to have a substantial fraction of their vehicles and platforms automated by some date, which I think has already passed.
Right.
And then they realized even with their financing that was just unrealistic. So they backed down substantially on that goal. But defence is taking a sort of long-term view to this. In Australia, it's not just about removing defence personnel out of harm's way. People always talk about dull, dirty and dangerous. And dangerous is definitely an issue with defence issues. Part of it is just scale and force projection. So you have a limited size defence force in terms of absolute numbers in Australia. You have a very large landmass and surrounding sea area. And so it's not just about removing people from danger. It's just you can't cover the area without some sort of automated or semi-automated technology that massively scales up your reach.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about when we've been talking about the military side, and yes, it can protect people, but you think about drones and unmanned drones and the sort of the lack of accountability about being able to sort of drop a bomb from a drone, which doesn't, without any risk to to a person flying over. So is that, what are some of the ethical issues around autonomous vehicles? I'm not just in military, but on the road, and because I'm fascinated by that side of it as well.
So in civilian applications, people always talk about the hypothetical trolley problem, whereby if the autonomous vehicle is in a split-second accident situation, how does it decide what course of action to take? There's problems with these hypotheticals because they're absolute hypotheticals, and all humans know that nothing is ever certain, and so they have trouble reasoning through them. Speaking sort of at a 30,000 foot view, you would hope that all the key stakeholders would have some sort of generally agreed upon framework for minimizing harm. There's no perfect definition of that, and that would be a definition that is constantly reevaluated by all the key stakeholders, and those stakeholders have to include vulnerable members of the public who tend to not have enough say in these technological matters, and that you could continually monitor and refine that process until it's sort of maximally acceptable to everyone.
Yeah. And that trolley situation, or trolley example you mentioned, is that sort of how do I decide who to hit, kind of, or I'm going to hit someone? And is that some scenario that people are tackling?
Yeah, and there's infinite scenarios. There's also, if you're after a bit of lighter humor to distract you, there's some animations online where people animate increasingly farcical, ridiculous trolley problems, which are fun to go through. But a common example of this would be you have a passenger inside an autonomous vehicle, and there's a situation where it's either going to have to hit a brick wall or it's going to have to hit a pedestrian. And so these are really challenging situations because the passenger in the car has a lot more protection. Like, cars have awesome safety systems, but hitting a brick wall at 60 kilometers per hour is still going to have a high chance of bad outcomes. The pedestrian has no protection, is extremely vulnerable, so even a glancing blow could be fatal or cause serious injury. And the car can't model exactly what's going to happen because there's a degree of uncertainty. And so coming up with an acceptable framework for decision-making in that situation is challenging.
Yeah, and I guess we've never had to do that, right? Because people have controlled it and they make their own decisions.
We haven't had to do that specifically, but it is important to note that these trade-offs are already made in safety decisions that affect thousands of lives. So crash barrier protection, speed limits, they all implicitly have trade-offs in terms of value of life versus productivity, etc., baked into them. Yeah. And they are reviewed occasionally, and that's what should happen with autonomous vehicles.
You make it sound simple. Look, I think I'm not going to ask you about how long it's going to take before we see autonomous cars on the road.
Thank you.
I don't think I can expect you to answer that question, but I do want to finish with just a question which touching on, again, the legal side. And this is a question without notice, but if you were the Prime Minister of Australia for the day and you could change a law, and it doesn't have to be about autonomous vehicles, which one would you change?
I would make donations much more transparent and accountable. And this relates to big tech and autonomous vehicles. You want to make sure that all the parties that are lobbying for certain views, that everything around finances and other support in the political system is as transparent and obvious to everyone. I think that would go a long way to making our society a lot fairer.
Excellent. I didn't expect you to say that, but I think that's a great way to finish off. Thank you, Michael. It's been fascinating talking to you, and thanks again.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Thank you for tuning in to Legally Consumed, a consumer products podcast by the Consumer Products Law Firm. This was presented by Raph Goldenberg, Kay Ho, and Will McMinn from CIE Legal. Our theme song is by our very own CIE Legal house band, which is comprised of Will McMinn, Andrew Marr, and Andrew Thompson.
This podcast production is in partnership with Social Star.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure you follow us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. For more updates and behind-the-scenes footage, head to our Instagram at CIE Legal, all one word. You can also check out our website to listen to a range of episodes and find additional free information at www.cielegal.com.au. To get in contact with CIE Legal about consumer products legal services, reach out to us on info@cielegal.com.au. Thanks again for listening to Legally Consumed, and see you all in the next episode.